investment and development. Let me leave political economy at that for the moment. And unfortunately, I've gone into far too much detail on all of these things once again. And I was hoping to get much further into international law and international organizations and human rights. But let me nonetheless make a few opening comments with regard to that before I let you go today, so we can hopefully deal with this and get completely caught up by the end of our last lecture, which I'm confident you will be able to do. You have, of course, all heard a great deal about international law, especially in the last week or so. This morning, Mr. Obama, who read the New York Times this morning, announced that the referendum that is proposed for the Crimea on its joining Russia or separating from the Ukraine is unconstitutional and contrary to international law. Seeming to indicate that international law carries a great deal of weight in how states relate to one another. And that Russia must abide by, as the United States abides by, or that is implicitly the case. So what is international law? Where does it come from? And how important is it to understanding international politics? What I'll use it for today is merely talk very briefly about the different perspectives of scholars on that matter and the sources of international law. Realists, not surprisingly, argue that international law certainly is relevant, certainly is important to understanding international politics, but is something that is likely to be promoted first and foremost and primarily by weak states. States seek security, especially weak states. And seeking security is expensive. Causes them to divert large amounts of their resources to armaments, which have zero impact in raising the standard of living of their citizens, and instead require the diversion of resources away from more productive investments into guns. So the guns and butter versus the dynamic. That should push all states in the direction of trying to minimize these costs by creating norms and a regime of international law to free themselves from international anarchy. But the upshot of it is, and especially the emphasis on the motivations of the weak in supporting international law, is that when push comes to shove, it doesn't change the overall picture. No matter how much international law there is on the books, no matter how deeply entrenched it is in our psyches, it doesn't change the reality that in the international system, the powerful do what they want and the weak suffer what they must. And while liberals don't generally disagree with this, or overall description of where international law is at this point, they would argue that nonetheless, it has to be a key component to the long-term project of overcoming international anarchy and enhancing international cooperation. And thus, liberals, more than anyone else, are probably the proponents of expanding international law, and in particular, putting more bite into international law. In other words, making it something that is more enforceable. That is the basis for which states can be sanctioned if they violate international law. Marxists, by contrast, and not too surprisingly, argue that international law is merely a means of stabilizing the existing distribution of wealth and power, but not a means of changing it. We'll come back to those observations a little bit later. Let me talk a little bit about how international laws come into existence what different kinds of international law there are. Basically, there are a number of different types of international law. Your textbook categorizes them into three different categories: constitutive, procedural, and regulative. I would add an issue-specific component to that, although that's merely bickering with the details. Suffice it to say that the most important aspects of international law are those that are generally considered constitutive international law. And they take primacy over just about every other aspect of international law. And key to that constitutive aspect of international law is the cornerstone of the international system, which is the concept of sovereignty. The concept of sovereignty. Along with the implications thereof, which is the self-determination, or the right to the self-determination of nations, and the right to non-intervention in the internal affairs of states by foreign entities. Those are the basic building blocks of the international system. Beyond that, we have procedural, or what others call fundamental international law, which defines the basic norms of coexistence, such as diplomacy, contractual international law, multilateralism, and so on. The basic idea that when states interact with one another, there are means by which these interactions have to take place. And those means, first and foremost, are the interaction through diplomacy, and in the case of multilateral institutions like the UN, diplomacy within those multilateral institutions. A third category is often described as regulative, which tries to regulate the behavior of states. Among those are, for example, the responsibility to protect doctrine that was adopted by the United Nations in the 1990s, and it defines how states should act when confronted with gross human rights violations. The international community, according to this doctrine, has a responsibility to intervene, to stop human rights violations if they are in a position to do so. It's often referred to as the R2P, responsibility to protect, and was passed in response to the horrendous events of 1994 in Rwanda, and preceding that, the ethnic cleansing and so on in Yugoslavia. In each of these cases, the international community intervened, but intervened rather belatedly. And according to the many champions of the responsibility to protect, such as Samantha Powers, who's the current UN ambassador, or US ambassador to the UN, the responses were entirely inadequate, in particular in regard to the genocide in Rwanda. Regulative international law, however, contains a number of norms. And among those norms are the norm that your textbook calls the nuclear taboo. The basic norm that states do not use nuclear weapons against their enemies, even if their enemies are not in a position to retaliate against them. And indeed, nuclear weapons have not been used since their first use in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The basic norm that the territorial integrity of a state is sacrosanct and cannot be violated by force is again such a regulative norm. Beyond that, there are some more issue-specific regimes that were created largely through treaties. Treaties banning chemical weapons, for example. Treaties banning nuclear proliferation and nuclear testing. Treaties banning the use or storing of landmines. All of these are issue-specific regimes that have been created in order to regulate the behavior of states. Now let me finish off by simply pointing out that international law, according to its champions, has been overwhelmingly effective. The vast majority of states abide by international law most of the time. And indeed, in this regard, as legal experts have pointed out, laws can only really be effective insofar as they are spontaneously observed by most people, even within political communities. And in this regard, the observation of most of the bodies of international law that exist by most states most of the time is a considerable achievement. However, as the realists pointed out, when push comes to shove, we still haven't gotten very far from the situation of the powerful doing what they want and the weak suffering what they must. And thus, the powerful in this case may be Russia, that feels free to violate the sanctity of the borders of the Ukraine by facilitating the removal of the Crimea from it. The violators might just as easily be the United States, which also violated, some would argue, the sovereignty of the state of Ukraine by acting in a way as to undermine or overthrow a legitimately recognized and legitimately elected government under a legitimate constitution, that of Yanukovych. And indeed, the leaked conversations between Victoria Nuland and the American ambassador seem to indicate that the United States' plan was precisely to overthrow that government. And it's kind of rich at this point that the Obama administration says that the referendum that the Russians are trying to, or the Russian-speaking minorities in the Crimea are trying to use in order to separate from the Ukraine are unconstitutional. Well, the United States just backed a government that overthrew a constitutionally elected government, and the new constitution was voted in by a rump of the parliament that overthrew the old constitution, and thus has even less legitimacy than the previous constitution. And in that sense, again, it demonstrates to some extent that there is a great deal of hypocrisy to go around in the international world. That has not come to an end, but it is something that we will explore in a bit more detail next class. So I apologize if I took a little bit too long once again, but let me leave it at that.